So today we're going to speak about Krishna, basically. In the Bhagavata Purana, I explained that last time. Bhagavan, as in Bhagavad Gita, means the Lord, basically, and Bhagavata means about the Lord. So Bhagavata Purana roughly means like the ancient story of the Lord. So the Bhagavatam, just to review, last time we mentioned there were 18 major Puranas, 6 for people in each of the 3 material qualities, goodness, passion, and ignorance. And the Bhagavata Purana by far has been the most important, not only the most popular, but also, in a sense, the most sophisticated. Just to give you an example, there are, just like you find in other traditions, in Jewish literature, traditional Jewish literature, Talmudic studies, and so on, and Christian literature, Buddhist literature, there are commentaries on sacred texts. So the 18 major Puranas, most of the 18 major Puranas don't have a single commentary. Because these are very big books, and it's a lot of work to do a commentary. You've got to go through, between 12, 15, 18, 20, 30, 40,000 verses. And a lot of it's stories, a lot of it's these very far-out stories and lists of kings. So for most of the Puranas, there's not a single commentary. And for a minority of the Puranas, there are 1 or 2 commentaries. For the Bhagavata Purana, there are existing today 81 commentaries. In other words, there's like maybe 10, almost 10 times more commentaries on the Bhagavata Purana than all the other Puranas put together. And there are, of course, commentaries that don't exist anymore, that have been lost. So the Bhagavatam was the first and the first Purana to be translated into European languages, and the one that was the most often translated into European languages. The central figure of the Bhagavata Purana, of course, is Krishna. And Krishna is not mentioned in the Rig Veda explicitly. The word Krishna appears, but it's not clear it's referring to a deity. Now, in the Bhagavad Gita in chapter 4, Krishna himself says that the reason that he's appearing in this world and the reason that he's speaking Bhagavad Gita is because the real spiritual science has been lost. And so if you look back, let's say from within the tradition, from within the Krishna tradition, the Vaishnava tradition, which is very central to Hinduism, the fact that the older literature doesn't talk about Krishna sort of confirms it, or is consistent with what Krishna says in the Gita, that although I am the Lord, the original science, the original spiritual teaching has been lost, and now I've come to reestablish it, to again establish what's forgotten. So that's basically what Krishna says in the Gita, and so we don't find Krishna in the oldest literature. And then Krishna starts to appear, though, in somewhat later literature, such as some of the Brahmin literature, or Chandogya Upanishad, there's a reference to Krishna as a son, I believe, the son of Devaki, his mother. Also, in Megasthenes' book, we talked about him. He wrote that book about India called Indica, which means about India. Anyway, he mentions Heracles, which for the Romans and for us is Hercules. So Hercules, what we call Hercules, the Arnold Schwarzenegger of this time, what we call Hercules, of course, in Greek is Heracles. And interestingly, because when the Megasthenes went to India, he sort of heard about Hare Krishna, and so he called it Heracles. That was his thing for Hare Krishna, Heracles. He thought it was just the Indians worshiping Hercules, just like we do back in Heracles, like we do back in Greece. Then, about 100 years before Jesus, another Greek gentleman, actually named Heliodorus. Heliodorus means he adores the sun. So Mr. Sun worshipper, Heliodorus was converted. He came to India as a Greek ambassador and became a devotee of Krishna. He became a devotee of Krishna. This is 100 years before Jesus. This is very significant because some of the first Indologists, some of the first scholars from Europe that went to India were also Christian missionaries, and they were annoyed to find that they sort of assumed that when they went to these heathen countries, especially non-Caucasian heathen countries, that they would find people that had no notion of mature theism, old-time religion. They expected to find a bunch of sort of whooping and hollering polytheists and so on, totem worshippers. So when they found that there was an extremely sophisticated theistic tradition, believing in one God, and they had all this really cool literature, and it was like embarrassingly equal to, if not in some ways more sophisticated than all the gifts they had brought. One of their first tactics was to declare that, some early followers of Jesus must have come to India, and that's where this stuff comes from. So therefore, the worship of Krishna and the Bhagavad Gita must be the result of early Indian contact with some apostles of Jesus. Because obviously, these primitive people could never in a million years, on their own, unaided by Caucasian Christians, have come up with a sophisticated form of monotheism. So when they found this column put up by Heliodorus, who obviously could afford to have a column erected in India, to Krishna, it blew apart that theory, and it became obvious that long before the advent of Jesus in this world, there were very sophisticated and culturally and theologically impressive forms of monotheism, devotion to a personal God, existing in India, especially focused on Krishna. So there's that column to Krishna, which Heliodorus was kind enough to erect in a city called Vaisnagar, and you can still go and see it for free. So devotion to Krishna. Krishna is a very interesting figure in Indian history because he's not like a one-trick pony, so to speak. On the one hand, Krishna is seen as the speaker of the Bhagavad Gita, which is, as we've discussed many times, the single most important, popular, revered book of Hinduism. So you have this super book, this super scripture, Bhagavad Gita, and the speaker is Krishna. And then you have the Mahabharata, which is the greatest historical epic of Indian history, and the main hero is the same guy, Krishna. So you have Krishna, the speaker of the most important sacred book, the most important philosophical text. You have Krishna being probably the single most important figure in Indian political, military, and social history, coming and being really the catalyst and the guy behind the scenes who's making everything happen in the Mahabharata. And, as if that were not enough, there's a whole other aspect of Krishna which is perhaps the most popular of all in India. And that is Krishna's, Sanskrit word is Leela, a word which perhaps first occurs in the Brahma Sutras, second book. But anyway, Leela. Leela means sort of like pastimes, sporting activities, things you do just because you feel like it. This would not include like going to work or paying your taxes or anything which you have to do because there's some law or some pressure or you have some personal need. Leela means when you're completely free and just having a great time what you do. Like your play or, you're playing. Not child's play, but, just your free, having fun stuff. So this is the word which is often used to describe the activities of God for the simple reason that, as stated I think in the Shvetasvatara Upanishad, that natasya karyam karanam vidyate, that there's nothing that God has to do. One of the definitions of God is that, God doesn't have to pay taxes or stop at the red light. Or, in other words, God is completely independent, the one absolutely free being. Whereas we are under the laws of nature, for example. We cannot leap tall buildings with a single bound. That's some old Superman stuff. Is that before your time? You never heard that? You heard it? I want to make sure you're culturally in touch. So, we are not free. We are in many ways under the laws of nature. And we have bodies that are severely limited by nature. They're born, they die. We can't just leap into the sky all the way to Jupiter. There's a lot of things we can't do. In fact, if you made a list of the things we can do and things we can't do, the list of things we can do would be much bigger. So God is absolutely free. God has no obligation. God can do anything. And natasya karyam karanam chadidite, and so on. So therefore, God's activities are called lila. Having a major demographic shift out there. So God's activities are called lila, and so Krishna lila or Ram lila and so on. Those are people struggling to get into this class. Now, a very interesting feature of the Bhagavad Purana is that in other literatures like the Mahabharata, it's said that God is Vishnu, or Narayan, and then there are many avatars, which we discussed last time. Avatars are incarnations of God in this world. One of them is Krishna. However, the Bhagavad Purana takes a different view. And it takes a view which, ironically, is confirmed by the Bhagavad Gita, which is in the Mahabharata. But anyway, maybe a little confusing. The Bhagavad Purana takes the view that Krishna is actually the original form of God. And so the debate here is, it's not like living gods and dead gods or false gods and true gods. Everyone agrees that Vishnu, Krishna, these are all different manifestations of God. No one's arguing about that. But what they're discussing is who is the avatar in. In other words, who is the source of all the avatars? If there are all these avatars of the Lord, who is the source? Is there an original form? An example is given in a work called Brahma Samhita that just says one candle can light many candles. And all the candles are candles. However, there was an original candle. So is there an original form of God? So that when God is not, let us say, coming to this world, performing different activities for different purposes, but just really, totally, absolutely kicking off his divine shoes and being himself, what is that form of God? And the Bhagavad Purana says that's actually Krishna. This is actually the original form. And that Vishnu comes from Krishna. It's sort of like Vishnu is God at the office, creating the world, superintending souls, and then God at home is Krishna. So, that's a sort of rough example. Anyway, the Bhagavad Purana, when it was written, it's very hard to date. We talked about Puranas. That genre is a very slippery one because it is a mixture of texts from many, many different historical periods. So when you read in a simple, if not simplistic, textbook that, let's say, Puranas come from this period, all that means is that's the date of the latest material in the Purana. The Atharva Veda, which at the very, very recent est, was written about, let's say, about 1,000 years BCE. In other words, it's 3,000 years old and probably much older than 3,000 years old, mentions Puranas. The oldest Upanishads mention Puranas. So it's obvious that there was Puranic material many, many thousands of years before they were supposed to be written. So again, when you see dates of Puranas, that's just the date of the very, very latest material that you can date. There's all kinds of earlier material. Yes?
The article that we read states that the Mahabharata says that Vishnu is the source of all incarnations, but it also says that the Bhagavad Gita states that Krishna is the source of all incarnations.
Oh yeah, I left that out. Yeah, exactly. The Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, I'm the source of everything. Krishna speaking as Krishna to Arjuna. So the Bhagavad Gita, in a sense, confirms the Bhagavad Purana.
But the Bhagavad Gita is in the Mahabharata.
I know. The Mahabharata, I hope this doesn't crush any of your preconceptions, but Mahabharata is actually, in many ways, a corrupt text. And by corrupt, I mean that's sort of a loaded word. By that I mean, and this was the opinion given by Sripad Madhvacharya, the great South Indian Acharya Madhva. The idea is that it was an oral tradition for many thousands of years. And oral traditions are notoriously unstable because they are oral traditions. It's just like this huge historical telephone game. And so it was an oral tradition for thousands of years, then finally it got written down. When it did get written down, it had already diversified regionally in many different parts of India into different recensions. It's all recognizably the same book, but there's different versions of it. And it was interpolated and so on. So the Sanskrit text of the Mahabharata we have now, in fact, many scholars call it a tradition. It's a whole literary tradition because it's just like this huge Hindu encyclopedia that's got just everything in it. So it's just like a literary tradition, multi-regional, has all kinds of different viewpoints. It's an amazing book. But the Bhagavad Gita, because of its special status, was preserved much more carefully, and you couldn't mess with it in the same way. I mean, the Bhagavad Gita is tiny. It's only 700 verses. And the 700 verses compared to, say, the Mahabharata, the complete Mahabharata, was at least 100,000 verses. So the Mahabharata is over 100 times bigger, maybe 120 times bigger than the Bhagavad Gita. So the Gita was very small, it was sacred, easy to control, easy to keep intact, whereas the Mahabharata was, it's like all over the place. That's the short explanation. So, any other questions on what we've talked about so far? If not, we'll go to the content of the Bhagavad Purana. The Bhagavad, or the Srimad Bhagavatam, it's also called. It has 12 skandhas or cantos, 12 books. And the book, which is by far the most famous, is the 10th book, which tells the life of Krishna. And I didn't mention the third point. You're all so polite. I said I was going to tell you something I didn't, and everyone's just politely tolerating it. The three aspects of Krishna. One aspect of Krishna was he's a speaker of the Gita. The other aspect was that he's the hero, ultimately, of the Mahabharata. The third thing is that his childhood Leela, that's how I got off on this thing, his childhood activities, which are sometimes called, or often called in Sanskrit, just Bala Leela, just his childhood pastimes. In Vrindavan, Krishna basically lived in 3 different places during his life in this world, according to all the traditions. He was born actually in Mathura. If you know the geography of India, Mathura is just about how many kilometers south of Delhi? 200 kilometers, 100 miles, something like that. 150, maybe 150 miles south of Delhi, just straight south. Anyway, Krishna was born in Mathura, but at his birth, we'll explain why. Literally, moments after he was born, he was actually taken out of Mathura to save his life to a village called Vrindavan, a cow herding village. You can still go there and visit there. It's a sacred city full of temples, which it's not far from Mathura. Anyway, so Krishna lived in Vrindavan about 12 years, and his activities in Vrindavan are his most popular. Because Krishna playing as a child, dancing with the cowherd girls, we'll go into some of the details. Krishna's activities as a child are, I think by far, with really no comparison, the most popular stories in Indian religious history. Just the activities of Krishna as a child, which are considered to be very charming, very beautiful stories. Krishna as a baby, as a child, as a 10, 11, 12-year-old boy, what he did in Vrindavan. So these, in fact, there are huge numbers of Vaishnavas in India that focus almost exclusively on Krishna's activities in Vrindavan. Even more than Krishna as a speaker of the Gita, because the idea is that even though Krishna was only a child, and then at the age of 12 he was brought back to Mathura. He was brought back there by the king of Mathura, Kamsa, his uncle, who wanted to kill him. Kamsa was a demon that wanted to kill Krishna, and it was out of fear of Kamsa that Krishna originally was taken out of Mathura as soon as he was born, so that Kamsa wouldn't try to kill him. So Krishna went back there at the age of 12 and killed Kamsa, actually. Krishna was undefeated. And then other demons were attacking Mathura, and so finally, to save his relatives and friends who lived in Mathura, Krishna created a this is the story. Krishna created this celestial city, this beautiful celestial city, and sort of made it float on the Arabian Sea. If you know Indian geography, just Gujarat is sort of on the west coast of India, central west coast. And then off the coast of Gujarat, Krishna created this celestial city, made it float on the water just offshore, where he put it, and that was Dwarka. So for most of the Mahabharata, during most of the activities of the Mahabharata, with the Pandavas, the battle, the political intrigue, and so on, Krishna lives in Dwarka. So Krishna lived in these three places, and there's a very interesting theology, which is prominent theology about Krishna, that Krishna as a child living in Vrindavan, this is in a sense the original form of Krishna. This is the original form of Krishna, that in the innumerable spiritual abodes, that there's a spiritual universe. In that spiritual universe, there are innumerable spiritual abodes. And the highest of them all is Vrindavan. So that when Krishna, in fact, in this world, a term the theologians use is Bhoma Vrindavan. Bhoma is from the word Bhumi, which means earth, earthly Vrindavan. The idea is that when Krishna comes down to this world, he actually brings his own spiritual abode with him and manifests it in this world. So that when you go to Vrindavan in India, in Uttar Pradesh, there's an external material Vrindavan, which is the material place, complete with open air sewers and all kinds of great stuff. So, but that Vrindavan that we see with our material eyes is quite superficial, and beneath the surface is the spiritual world. It's actually there, manifested in this world. And that's very much the, yes?
You said Boma means what?
Boma, it means earthly, from the word bhumi. I remember that a friend of mine who was a very prominent Protestant theology professor at Harvard went to Vrindavan once, and it kind of really zapped him. So, I mean, many people go to Vrindavan, even people that have, are not devotees of Krishna, and it really hits them. So, anyway, that's very much the understanding in Vrindavan. That's very much the understanding in the Vaishnava community, that the spiritual world is actually present there, and there's sort of like this film, this mundane film, this covering, which is just kind of, it's a third world city in India. And beneath that covering is the spiritual Vrindavan. And, well, actually, huge numbers of people believe they are experiencing that. And there are other places like that. So people also go to Mathura, which is Krishna's birthplace, and Dwarka also. It's very interesting because these ancient texts, like the Bhagavata Purana, say that when Krishna left this world, went back to the spiritual world, that the ocean rose and covered Dwarka. So Dwarka was sort of withdrawn by Krishna. And modern archaeology has shown that the sea, in fact, did rise. I mean, that's the part that we know for sure. The sea did rise. In fact, there's now a pilgrimage place called Dwarka, which is on the mainland of Gujarat. It's on the coast there. So it's not considered to be the original island city that Krishna created. But just on the mainland, just across from that, there is a holy city called Dwarka. In fact, for Shankara, even for Shankara, the Vedantas, that was one of the 4 holiest cities in India. And underwater excavation has discovered in the last 10, 20 years that there were actually these huge, prosperous harbors and ports that were covered by the ocean. So the ocean very much rose and covered all kinds of things. And so they're still actually excavating, trying to find Krishna's original city. So, but the pastimes in Vrindavan, I thought, are by far the most popular. In fact, there are some devotees who I think they're kind of a little out of control. And they say, they prefer, they don't even want to read the Bhagavad Gita, which I think is a little pretentious, but because they say we're interested in Krishna in Vrindavan. So Krishna in Vrindavan as a child, these childhood pastimes are really the heart, I'd say, of probably the most prominent feature of Vaishnavism in India. Very, very prominent. Krishna's childhood pastimes in Vrindavan. So politically and militarily, they're not so important, but spiritually they're considered to be the highest because they're more intimate. When Krishna becomes a prince, in Mathura and Dwarka, Krishna is a prince. So politically, militarily, of course, he had a more prominent role to play in the history, but it's considered these are the most intimate affairs. Especially Krishna dancing with the gopis, the cowherd girls. And so I thought I'd go over some of these things. Do you remember from the Mahabharata story, Kamsa, Krishna's uncle, was actually, according to various scriptures, in his past life, the celestial demon. Vishnu killed him. He wanted revenge against Vishnu. He was always terrified, but he was always paranoid that Krishna was going to come and kill him again. So when he heard that Krishna had taken birth on earth to remove the demons from the earth because they had invaded the earth, Kamsa was always paranoid, so he wanted to kill Krishna as soon as Krishna was born. And he heard a prophecy that Krishna would be born as the 8th child of Devaki. Devaki is Krishna's mother. And so Kamsa imprisoned Krishna's parents, Devaki and Vasudeva. He imprisoned them, and every time one of their children was born, he killed that child. So even though he knew Krishna would be the 8th child from the prophecy, he killed the other 7 children. So he was not a nice guy. He was not a nice guy, and then Krishna actually was born. And it was Krishna. It was really Krishna coming into the world as an avatar. And his parents knew, obviously they'd lost their first 7 children. They were heartbroken, so they knew that Kamsa would try to kill Krishna. And therefore, as soon as the child was born, it's a very interesting story. The story is that Krishna first appeared as Vishnu because he wanted to show his parents that he was really God, so don't worry, don't be afraid. And so he first appeared not as a baby. There's a whole story. First he appeared within the mind of his father, and then he was transferred from the mind of his father to the womb of his mother, and then came out not as a child, but as Vishnu. And then when his parents saw him, they understood it's really him. But he understood they were afraid that, Kamsa's going to see it. So he transformed himself into a little human baby. And then his father was desperate to get him out of there before Kamsa came and realized the child was born. So there's a famous story that you can see innumerable Indian paintings of this. It said there was sort of a violent storm going on, and Mathura and Vrindavan are on the Jamuna River. They're both on the Jamuna River. So his father took him out in the middle of the storm and had to cross the river to get him away. And it said that the river divided. Moses, tent and all that. So this raging river just divided, and it said that Anantashesha, who was sort of a cobra incarnation, came and provided this covering over Krishna's father in the storm, and the river divided, and his father just crossed the river and took Krishna to Vrindavan, where they had allies, because Kamsa was not only wanted to kill Krishna, he was persecuting his own dynasty, the Yadu dynasty, because he had usurped the throne and wanted to kill even the people in his own extended family. Yes?
You said the parents knew that he was born as Vishnu?
Yes.
Why would they be scared for his safety?
It's an interesting point. It's a very good point. This again is Leela, because even though they saw that he was God, they didn't know what he would do. Like, will he just act like a human being and allow himself to be attacked? They just didn't know what he would do. Plus, it said they loved him so much that it sort of overcame their theology. Their parental love overcame their theology. And this is one of the main features of Vaishnavism, especially devotion to Krishna in India. The idea that you love Krishna so much that you sort of forget his power or his omnipotence, and you love him as a real child. So that's a very prominent part of Krishna Bhakti in India. So they took Krishna to Vrindavan, and they placed him, and it said at that time Yashoda, very, very famous figure in Hinduism, Yashoda had just also had a child in Vrindavan. And Yashoda was destined to actually be Krishna's foster mother. She had had a baby daughter who was no other than Devi, the goddess, Durga. She had had her own child. Because, in other words, the whole team was coming down to earth. to rid the earth of the demons. So Krishna came, and then Devi came. So anyway, Vasudeva exchanged children because he thought that Kamsa's expecting a son. If he sees a daughter, he won't do anything. So then he left Krishna there, and it said Yashoda had a child and was still sleeping, didn't actually, had sort of fallen unconscious during childbirth, spontaneous childbirth, didn't know hadn't seen her child. She was unconscious, and so Vasudeva put the child there and then took the goddess back to Mathura. By the way, it said the prison doors opened. Krishna has this power, it said, called Yoga Maya, his spiritual power. And it said that Krishna, when Vasudeva was taking him away, Krishna made the prison doors open. He actually made the shackles on his parents just come undone. So then Vasudeva went back, put the shackles back on because he couldn't get away. Kamsa had his spies and troops everywhere. And he didn't want to arouse suspicion. Then Kamsa heard there was a child born, came in the morning and saw that it was actually a girl. He was confused because the celestial prophecy had said that it would be a male child. So Kamsa was so cruel that he was just, he was gone. So he took this little infant, this female infant, just born, and he took her by the legs and was just going to smash her against the stone floor of the prison. And so he grabbed her little legs, but when he raised her, it said she slipped right out of his hands and went up into the sky and manifested herself as the goddess with all these, really dangerous weapons. And so Kamsa was, oh no, this is... And then there's this great scene where the goddess is just there in the sky with all these, horrific weapons. And she says to Kamsa, you fool, the child who will kill you has already taken birth and is now living somewhere else. So, and then she just vanished. The goddess vanished. And then Kamsa, it ruined his whole day. So, but Kamsa was so obsessed with killing Krishna that, there are interesting parallels with the Old Testament story of the Pharaoh. Kamsa ordered that every newborn child in his kingdom should be put to death. And so he sent troops around to put to death. I think it was every male child, every newborn male child was put to death. Anyway, so then Krishna, meanwhile, was raised in Vrindavan, which was a cowherd village. Even though he was born within a princely dynasty, his parents were royalty. Vrindavan was just this cowherding village. Very sort of simple, good-hearted cowherding people. And Krishna was raised by them as a cowherd boy. And so he's, again, it's hard to exaggerate how famous and central these things are in Hinduism. Krishna, for example, one famous name he has is Govinda Gopala. I mean, there are innumerable songs using these names. Gopala means a cowherd. And Govinda, who gives pleasure to the cows. And so Krishna was raised as... Now, Kamsa gradually learned that Krishna was in Vrindavan. He actually found out that Krishna was in Vrindavan. And he decided to kill Krishna. So he sent this series of demons, many of whom had a power called Kamarupa. Kama means desire, as in Kama Sutra. Well, I'm not going to write Kama Sutra. Anyway, Kamarupa. Desire form. Rupa means like a visible form. They had this yogic power where they could change their form at will. Or sometimes you find in English fables, shape-shifting demons. So, Putana. Putana was your standard ogress. She was this sort of like this monstrous lady who had all these fantastic powers. And she was sent to Vrindavan to kill Krishna. She was the first hit person sent there. So she used her power to change herself into this incredibly beautiful form as just like this most lovely young lady that no one would, basically all doors open, kind of like as soon as she walked in, yeah, right this way, or do whatever you want, because she was just this young, incredibly beautiful young lady. It said she looked like the goddess of fortune. So she had smeared this lethal poison on her nipples. And she came right into the home of Krishna. Again, this little cowherd village, everyone's very innocent. Oh, look at the cute baby, the usual thing. And then she said to Krishna's mother, foster mother Yashoda, can I nurse your child? This is a rural culture, everyone's nursing. So, no Walmart formula there. So anyway, so Yashoda, being very innocent, said, yeah, of course. So she took Krishna on her lap and, pushed her nipple into his mouth. Now, Krishna, of course, was no fool. Even though he was a baby, he ultimately, according to the tradition, is the omniscient God. So Krishna, it said, first sucked out the milk from her breast, and then he just sucked out her life. He just sucked her life out. And there's this heavy scene. It's interesting. It said that he accepted the milk because Krishna accepts whatever you offer to him. So even though she had diabolical motives, she did offer that breast milk, and so Krishna accepted the offering and then pulled out her life. So it said that as she was dying, she began to scream out. And I forget the exact Sanskrit word, but it's like child, like, release me, release me. And so as she was dying, because she had no more strength, she lost her power to keep her artificial form. And it says she just suddenly manifest as this monstrous lady, because she didn't have the power to keep this artificial form, this huge monstrous, and she was just like breaking walls down as her body expanded. And everyone came running. This is a typical scene in Vrindavan. All the inhabitants of the village come running, like, what happened, what happened? And when everybody gets her, they just see Krishna playing on her breast, just sort of crawling around, laughing, and I'm trying to figure out, like, what happened here? So that's a typical scenario where Krishna does these things, and yet because he so much cherished the love of the residents of Vrindavan, who are all actually the greatest yogis in their previous lives, and they had gotten to this point of being personal associates of Krishna, that he would always sort of make it look like something else. We were trying to figure out, like, what happened? How did this monster come into the village, and who killed her? And no one knew how she died. So that was the first attempt on Krishna's life in Vrindavan. Then there was a demon called Trinavarta, which means literally kind of like the straw whirler. Another demon with mystic powers, he came into Vrindavan, picked up Krishna. He transformed himself into this whirlwind. He picked up Krishna on his shoulder and carried him into the sky. He was going to sort of like drop him from way up in the sky, sort of whirled up in the sky. But Krishna made himself so heavy. He was sort of like as heavy as, like really heavy. And the demon just kind of like fell to earth and was smashed to pieces on a stone slab. So that was Trinavarta. And again, everyone came running, and all they saw was some really bad guy lying there dead, and Krishna just kind of like crawling around, laughing, and everybody's trying to figure out, like, what happened? So they began to feel that someone must be attacking Krishna, but God keeps saving him. This is like the whole mood of this devotion to Krishna in Vrindavan, that his own family thought that God must be saving him, because they thought he was just an ordinary child. The idea is that Krishna did not want to interrupt their love for him just as a child, because he actually was relishing that innocent, pure love, and if they thought he was God, he would go into the whole awe and reverence mode. And Krishna preferred just their love, their sort of spontaneous love, that we're loving Krishna not because he's God, but because he's Krishna. After all, someone loves you for your money, or because you have some kind of power, or they love you for this or that, or because you're famous. Sometimes, the rich and famous, it's hard to find real friends because everyone loves them for, they want to sort of buy into all that glamour. So Krishna himself grew up in a place where no one really knew he was God. So they just loved him because they loved him. And that's really the essence of this whole Krishna Bhakti movement. The idea of loving Krishna just for Krishna. Not because he's God, he can do something for you. He'll save your neck, your soul, or some other part of you. So, Anyway, Putana, Trinavarta, there's another very famous scene. These are all famous pastimes of Krishna where his brother Balaram, also a form of God in the tradition, his brother Balaram came running to his mother when they were just little kids and said Krishna was eating dirt. That's his younger brother, sort of telling on his younger brother. Krishna was eating dirt. So his mother called him and said, were you eating dirt? He denied it. So his mother, and then he said, just you can look at my mouth and you can see I didn't eat dirt. So Krishna opened his mouth, his mother looked in, and suddenly she saw within his mouth the entire universe. She saw the entire universe within Krishna's body. And she started to think, is this really my son? So then Krishna removed that vision because, again, it was interfering with her maternal love. So he showed her the entire universe within his body and then withdrew that vision. That's another famous story. Then, there's so many famous stories. Maybe I'll tell two which are very important because, according to the tradition, this is Krishna's attempt to establish monotheism within the Indian tradition. Indra, who's mentioned the most in the Rig Veda, the god of rain, thunder, basically Zeus. One day when Krishna was about a 7-year-old child, he saw his village preparing to make an offering, standard offering, to Indra. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, when Krishna killed the witch Putana, he gave her salvation because he killed her and he thought that, well, she did offer me her milk. Her motives weren't the best, but whatever. And actually, just like Hiranyakashipu was saved by his son's request, so in all these killings, when Krishna kills all these demons, they're all liberated. They actually are all given salvation because they're killed by the Lord. So even the demons are given salvation. Then, so Krishna saw his village preparing to worship Indra, which in the Rig Veda time was the standard religious activity. That's the main thing you do. You offer these sacrifices. So Krishna said, there's no need to do that. There's no need to worship these nature gods. And he told them, you can just, whatever food you were cooking for Indra, for this sacrificial offering, he said, you can just give it to me and my friends. Of course, Krishna is speaking as God, capital G. So he's a child. He's just sort of playing around, but he's actually seriously establishing monotheism. And so, and again, another typical scene from Vrindavan, all the village elders, they think this is ridiculous. We have to, it's like if you have a kid, your little kid tells you, don't pay the gas bill, don't pay the electric bill, don't stop at the red light, don't follow the law, just do what I say. And I'm your little kid. It's like, isn't that cute? Did you hear what little Billy said? But obviously you don't do it. And yet when Krishna would make these crazy requests, like don't pay the cosmic utility bill, don't offer this to Indra, everyone, all the elders would just look at him and be so enchanted by his personal beauty, they would just say, okay. They didn't even know what they were doing. They were just completely enchanted by Krishna's beauty. And so they stopped the Indra Puja. The result was that Indra totally flipped. And he decided to teach the people of Earth a lesson by destroying Vrindavan. I'm going to destroy Vrindavan and teach people what happens when you don't, offer me what you're supposed to. So Indra sent these Samvartika clouds, these sort of, devastating clouds that destroy planets, and it was just flooding Vrindavan. He planned to just wipe the place out through a flood. So everyone was crying out. Now, even though they don't know Krishna is God, still, whenever there's real danger, they just cry out for Krishna. They don't even know why they're crying out for Krishna. They just, somehow or other, they just spontaneously cry out to Krishna. So everyone's crying and yelling because they're all about to be killed. So Krishna, this is one of the most famous activities of Krishna. It's celebrated all over India. Krishna went to this hill in the neighborhood of the village, Govardhan, and it said with the little finger of his left hand, he just lifted up this small mountain and held it aloft like an umbrella and just told everyone in the village, just come and stand under the hill. And they did. And so again, this is celebrated all over India, the Govardhan Puja. There's so many paintings, you see this all the time, of Krishna as a little child, 7-year-old child, standing there with the little finger of his left hand, holding this mountain up and his whole village, all his family, just standing under the mountain, and Indra trying unsuccessfully to destroy the mountain. So after a week of this, after a week of trying to destroy the village and seeing Krishna holding the mountain up, he thought, uh-oh, because he had heard that Krishna was the guy. After all, Indra, even the nature gods, they're ultimately working under the supreme god, and he had heard that Krishna's the guy. But he looked down at Vrindavan and thought, no, it is not Krishna. Because just some boy just playing, taking cows out to the pasture, just playing games with his boyfriends, and dancing with the girls out in the bushes. And so Indra thought that, no, this cannot be God. I refuse to accept this. But then after a week, when he saw what had happened, he realized that I'm in big trouble. So there's a famous scene. He came and surrendered to Krishna and offered beautiful prayers. Krishna forgave him and just said, just knock it off next. But the idea here is that the obvious theological teaching is that one should give up polytheism. One should give up worshiping nature gods for material benefits and worship the one supreme God. Another incident happened with Brahma, who is considered the creator of the universe. And Brahma also couldn't quite make the Krishna curve, like this cannot be God, this is like too far out, that God actually comes as a little boy and plays. And so what he did is he decided to just not destroy Vrindavan, but to test Krishna. So by his own power, he stole all of Krishna's boyfriends and all the calves and cows. He just stole everything and he hid them in some other place. And so then what Krishna did is that by his own power, he expanded himself into all the boys and all the cows. In other words, he remanifested them. It was actually only Krishna. But he took down to the last detail of their genetic codes. He actually manifested himself as all these boys and all the cows and calves. So when Brahma came back, everybody was still there, and he couldn't figure out what was going on. Then Krishna exhibited other mystic power, and Brahma, really, his brain started to melt. And then he came down and surrendered to Krishna. So there's, anyway, to make a long story short, Kamsa tried so many ways to kill Krishna, finally failed, then sent an invitation inviting Krishna and all the residents of Vrindavan to come to the capital Mathura for a wrestling match in which Kamsa planned to kill Krishna. And at that match, Krishna actually killed him. So, anyway, this is just a little bit of the life of Krishna, just to give you perhaps a little taste. But these stories are very, very central to bhakti in India. So I guess we'll stop here.